When a nation begins to treat domestic problems as military problems, it crosses a threshold that is very difficult to reverse. That is what happened when the Trump administration rebranded the long-running war on drugs as a campaign of direct military action. What should have remained in the realm of law enforcement, an issue of policing, courts, and diplomacy, has been recast as war. And war is not governed by restraint. War is governed by force. The distinction matters because once the military is used as a tool for problems traditionally handled through civilian institutions, the rule of law begins to erode. What we are seeing is not just a drug enforcement operation, it is a gradual, deliberate militarization of executive power. The deployment of U.S. naval forces in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific under the pretext of counter-narcotics operations is not simply about stopping drug boats. It is a projection of force executed without congressional debate, without transparency, and with legal justifications that rest on thin air. American aircraft, warships, and special operations forces are being employed in missions that resemble targeted killings more than law enforcement actions. There are no trials, no public charges, and no meaningful oversight. These are operations conducted with the same mindset that defined drone strikes in the Middle East: identify, strike, move on. That may make for strong political messaging, but it is a dangerous precedent in a constitutional republic. The problem with turning law enforcement into warfare is that the tools of war are blunt. War isn't about arrests or evidence. It's about overwhelming and destroying. And when you start applying that logic to criminal networks, you don't build stable legal systems. You create zones of exception where executive power overrides everything else. I've seen this pattern before in counterinsurgency campaigns overseas. Extraordinary measures justified in the name of security that quickly become normalized. Once those methods take root, they don't stay outside the homeland. They come back. The U.S. military is not designed to act as an arm of domestic criminal enforcement. Using it in that role creates moral, legal, and strategic problems. It blurs the line between external defense and internal control. It conditions the public to accept that war powers can be exercised without oversight whenever a president claims there is a threat, and it concentrates lethal force in the hands of one branch of government. The founders understood that war powers are dangerous in peacetime, which is why they vested them in Congress. That principle is being eroded. What Trump has done is not new. It's an acceleration of a trend that began decades ago. The militarization of the drug war has slowly stripped away legal checks and replaced them with executive fiat. But where previous administrations cloaked their actions in bureaucratic caution, Trump has made it personal, immediate, and public. The message is simple. If you're labeled a threat, the full force of the U.S. military can be turned against you. No courts, no hearings, no accountability. That is not how a republic behaves. That is how an empire behaves. When nations normalize warfare as a domestic, instrument of policy. The threshold for violence drops, and the path toward permanent exceptionalism opens. The war on drugs may be the justification today, but once that door is open, it rarely closes again. What begins on the water against traffickers does not stay on the water. It comes home, and when it does, the legal architecture of the republic will already be hollowed out. When a president can unilaterally order military action without congressional debate, oversight, or legal clarity, what you have is not just a policy shift, it's a structural transformation of power. Trump's approach to the drug war fits a long arc of executive expansion in the post-Cold War era, but it is far more direct, far less restrained, and far more personal. He has treated military power not as a last resort, but as a presidential instrument that can be applied on demand. In the language of Washington, it's called decisive action. In the language of constitutional governance, it's a dangerous circumvention of checks and balances. The founders understood the dangers of concentrating war-making power in one man's hands. They wrote a constitution that deliberately placed that power in Congress to prevent the emergence of a Caesar. Over time, however, successive administrations chipped away at those safeguards. The War Powers Resolution was gutted in practice. Drone strikes have normalized unilateral warfare. Special operations forces were deployed with minimal oversight. Now, Trump has taken the same executive machinery and applied it to the so-called war on drugs, treating it as a battlefield rather than a matter of law. He didn't ask Congress for authorization. He didn't build a legal case in the courts. He simply declared a threat and sent the military. This is how the architecture of a republic shifts toward imperial presidency. Each time a president exercises power this way, the precedent hardens. Future presidents will inherit those powers and use them more freely. What was once extraordinary becomes routine, and as war powers become routine, constitutional limits erode in plain sight. This isn't about whether drugs are a threat. It's about whether the executive branch can bypass the mechanisms designed to constrain it and do so with public approval because it looks strong. History gives us warnings here. When governments learn they can act without constraint under the banner of security, the scope of those actions always expands. Today, it's narco-traffickers in the Caribbean. Tomorrow, it could be anyone deemed a threat to stability. Once the executive learns that the military can be used without restraint, the targets grow, and the justification broadens. I've seen similar arcs of broad regimes that justified exceptional measures against enemies only to turn those powers inward. No democracy is immune to that temptation, especially when fear and populism are the fuel. What's equally dangerous is how this shift corrodes civil-military relations. The military's role is to defend a nation, not to act as the personal instrument of any president. When that line blurs, the armed forces are politicized, missions drift away from clearly defined strategic objectives and towards serving short-term political goals. That erodes trust both within the ranks and in the country they serve. And when trust collapses, the military becomes an extension of power, not a guardian of the republic. Unchecked executive power does not produce lasting security. It produces brittle institutions, and brittle institutions eventually break under pressure. The Constitution was designed precisely to prevent such concentrations of power, but paper constraints mean nothing if political culture accepts their erosion as normal. That is what worries me most. Trump's war on drugs is not just about boats in the Caribbean. It's about the slow normalization of presidential war-making without war. And once that normalization takes hold, it rarely disappears. Every administration has tried to wage the so-called war on drugs as if overwhelming force could solve what is fundamentally a structural, social, and economic problem. None has succeeded. Decades of interdiction campaigns, aérial surveillance, paramilitary raids, and foreign interventions have not stopped the flow of narcotics into the United States. They have not dismantled the networks that supply them. They have not ended the demand. Instead, they've produced militarized bureaucracies, shattered communities abroad, and eroded civil liberties at home. The failure is not because we didn't try hard enough. It's because the strategy itself is flawed, built on the illusion that you can wage war against a market, an economy, and human behavior. I saw it up close in my years in uniform. Drug interdiction missions looked decisive on paper, boats seized, arrests made, tons of cocaine or fentanyl captured. The numbers looked good in press conferences, but they meant nothing strategically. The supply chains simply adapted, shifting routes, replacing captured shipments, and recruiting new traffickers. It was a game of whack-a-mole on a global scale. Behind every intercepted shipment stood a vast, decentralized network that no amount of military force could eliminate. That's because trafficking is not an enemy army you can defeat on a battlefield. It's an economic engine fueled by demand, profit, and corruption. And those engines don't surrender. The militarization of the drug war has also made things worse in the countries where it's been waged. In Latin America, U.S. operations and training programs have often strengthened the most violent factions or destabilized fragile governments. Colombia, Mexico, Honduras, and others became staging grounds for what Washington called security cooperation. But what looked on the ground more like a proxy war, when soldiers and special forces replace police and judges, the rule of law becomes selective, and violence multiplies. Cartels adapt faster than bureaucracies can, and the local populations pay the price. We have repeated this pattern for half a century. There's also the domestic cost. Under the banner of the drug war, extraordinary powers were granted to law enforcement and intelligence agencies, powers that expanded surveillance, ensuite forfaiture, and no-knock raids. Those powers were justified as temporary, exceptional measures. They never went away. The militarization of policing, the erosion of Fourth Amendment protections, and the expansion of executive authority at home all trace their roots back to the same strategic failure. We built an entire security architecture around a war we could never win. The Trump administration did not invent this failure. It inherited it and accelerated it by turning interdiction into a theater of military force and executive spectacle. It doubled down on a strategy that has already failed for generations. The results will be the same fleeting tactical victories, long-term strategic erosion. We've been here before. Nixon declared war on drugs in 1971. Reagan militarized it further in the 1980s. Bush and Clinton exported it overseas. Obama institutionalized drone interdictions. Trump is simply taking it to its logical conclusion: open, unrestrained military action. History is not ambiguous about how this ends. You cannot bomb Zeiss or kill your way out of a black market economy. You can, however, hollow out your legal and political institutions. Trying. The drug war has never been a war against drugs. It has been a war against the symptoms of deeper problems waged with the wrong tools for the wrong reasons, with predictable outcomes. When the Trump administration expanded its war on drugs to target Venezuela, it wasn't just responding to trafficking routes, it was testing the boundaries of executive power and international law. Venezuela became a convenient stage for escalation, a place where military action could be cloaked in moral language about fighting cartels while advancing broader strategic objectives. The operation wasn't simply about intercepting narcotics. It was about asserting American power in a region where Washington had grown accustomed to acting without meaningful resistance. In many ways, Venezuela is less a target than a precedent, a proving ground for how far the executive can push military force without a formal war declaration. Venezuela has long been a political flashpoint for U.S. administrations. But under Trump, it became the centerpiece of a hybrid campaign that blurred the lines between counter-narcotics, regime change, and geopolitical signaling by publicly accusing the Maduro government of narco-terrorism and then deploying U.S. naval assets to the Caribbean. The White House effectively militarized what had been a diplomatic and economic confrontation. This was not a carefully calibrated law enforcement operation. It was the projection of force aimed at shaping political outcomes, and it happened without congressional authorization, without a declaration of war, and without a coherent strategy for what came next. I've seen this pattern before. When a president uses a foreign crisis as a testing ground for exceptional measures, those measures rarely remain exceptional. Reagan did it in Central America. Bush did it in the Middle East. Obama did it with drones in Africa and South Asia. Each time, the scope of presidential war-making expanded while congressional oversight and public debate eroded. Venezuela fits this arc perfectly. It allowed Trump to showcase strength, satisfy domestic political narratives, and set a precedent that future presidents will inherit all without paying the political price of a formal war. What makes this precedent especially dangerous is that it takes place in the Western Hemisphere. Historically, when the U.S. waged foreign wars, they were fought far away, often against adversaries who could not retaliate directly. Venezuela, by contrast, is in our immediate strategic neighborhood. Militarizing the conflict here doesn't just destabilize a distant region, it risks entangling the U.S. in a volatile situation with consequences that can reverberate across Latin America. It also undermines whatever diplomatic channels remain, turning what could have been negotiated into something driven by force. This approach also carries profound legal consequences. By labeling Maduro and members of his government as narco-terrorists, the administration effectively created a legal fiction that allowed the military to act without conventional constraints. Once a state is branded a criminal enterprise, any action can be justified as enforcement. But that is a dangerous way to conduct foreign policy. It collapses the distinction between state and non-state actors, between war and policing, and when those distinctions disappear, so do the guardrails that prevent escalation. Venezuela is not just another operation, it's a template. If a president can use military force against a foreign state under the cover of a drug war, then the threshold for similar actions elsewhere becomes dangerously low. Today it's Caracas. Tomorrow it could be any government accused of being linked to trafficking, terrorism, or simply opposing Washington's will. That is how empires operate in their twilight when the logic of force replaces the logic of law. When a nation uses its armed forces for missions that are legally vague and strategically dubious, it doesn't just risk operational failure, it corrodes the very legitimacy of the military itself. Over time, soldiers stop being seen as defenders of the nation and start being seen as tools of political will. That is exactly what happens when the armed forces are deployed for executive-driven campaigns like Trump's militarized drug war. These operations are not grounded in clear congressional authorization. They do not serve a defined strategic objective, and they lack the moral clarity that comes from defending the homeland against a direct threat. Instead, they transform the U.S. military into an instrument of presidential spectacle. Legitimacy is not something that can be manufactured after the fact. It's built on trust, the trust of the public that the military serves the Constitution, not any one man or administration. When that trust erodes, the consequences are long-lasting. History is filled with examples of states that blurred this line, where the military ceased to be a neutral institution and became an arm of executive power. In those cases, the institution itself became politicized, its authority questioned, and its moral standing weakened. What makes the U.S. military unique is not just its power, but its professional ethos, an ethos that depends on restraint, legality, and public confidence. Once that's compromised, it's not easily rebuilt. During my years in uniform, I saw firsthand how carefully senior commanders tried to guard that line, even in moments of intense political pressure. There was a clear understanding that the military must remain apolitical and act only under lawful authority. Trump's use of the military in counter-narcotics operations has taken a sledgehammer to that wall. By treating naval task forces and special operations units as personal instruments in a war he declared alone, he bypassed the institutional safeguards meant to protect that legitimacy. The men and women who serve are being placed in legally ambiguous situations, ordered to carry out missions that may satisfy political objectives but erode the professional integrity of the force. There's also the problem of mission clarity. When troops are deployed into operations with no clearly defined end state, it breeds cynicism and confusion within the ranks. Soldiers and sailors understand when they're fighting for the defense of the nation. They also understand when they're being used for something else. Prolonged exposure to legally questionable missions doesn't just wear down morale, it damages the relationship between the military and the society it serves. And that damage is cumulative. This erosion of legitimacy doesn't stop at the water's edge. Once the precedent is set for using the military as an unrestrained domestic and foreign enforcement tool, it opens the door for further politicization. Future presidents will inherit the power to do the same, perhaps in more aggressive ways. The military will be caught in the middle, forced to execute political decisions that lack a strategic foundation, and when the institution itself becomes politically tainted, it loses the trust that makes it effective. For the United States, this is not a distant or abstract risk. It's a real and growing problem. Every mission undertaken without lawful authority, every operation conducted for political theater, chips away at the foundation that holds the military above politics. Once that foundation is gone, the institution doesn't just weaken abroad, it weakens at home. And a military that has lost legitimacy is a weapon that no longer serves the republic. It serves whoever holds power. Every time the United States exports exceptional measures abroad, drone strikes, covert raids, extraordinary renditions, or now, military anti-drug operations in sovereign waters, those measures find their way back home. This is the nature of power without restraint. It never stays confined to foreign soil. When a president discovers he can use the military to act without legal limits overseas, it's only a matter of time before those same tools are turned inward. Blowback isn't just about unintended consequences abroad. It's about the gradual erosion of constitutional protections at home. The drug war is the perfect vehicle for this erosion because it carries a veneer of moral urgency. Who can argue against fighting drug traffickers? But beneath that veneer lies a steady transfer of power from the law to the executive. We've already seen the domestic implications of the drug war for decades, the militarization of local police forces, the expansion of surveillance programs, civil asset, forfeiture without trial, and the normalization of exceptional measures in routine policing. But under Trump, this logic intensified by treating traffickers abroad as enemy combatants and using the military against them, the legal threshold for deploying force has been lowered. That threshold doesn't remain external. The same narratives used to justify action abroad can be applied domestically. If the president can use lethal force against threats without congressional approval outside our borders, what prevents him or a future president from doing so inside them? History is full of warning signs. When empires begin to conflate internal and external enemies, the boundaries between war and policing dissolve. The tools of empire become the tools of governance. That's what happened with Rome when emergency powers became permanent. That's what happened in Britain when colonial counterinsurgency methods bled back into domestic security. And it's what happens whenever the language of permanent war becomes embedded in the political culture of a republic. The United States is not immune to that pattern. In fact, we've been walking that path for decades. Trump's war on drugs has simply accelerated it. There's also a deeper strategic cost. When a government becomes accustomed to bypassing legal oversight in the name of security, it changes the relationship between state and citizen. The public ceases to be sovereign. It becomes subject to executive authority. Force becomes normalized as a tool of policy rather than an exceptional last resort. And once the use of force is normalized at home, it breeds a culture of fear and dependency. People come to expect the military to solve problems that should be addressed through law, diplomacy, or governance. That's how republics hollow out from the inside. This blowback is not hypothetical. We can already see it in how militarized language shapes domestic politics, how protests are framed as security threats, how political opponents are labeled as enemies, how exceptional powers are discussed as if they were ordinary. The war on drugs has given every president since Nixon new levers of control. Trump has shown just how far those levers can be pulled without pushback. Once a power like this is normalized, it's rarely rolled back. It expands. The irony is that these measures don't solve the problems they claim to address. They don't end drug trafficking, and they don't make communities safer. What they do is centralize power, vacant institutions, and blur the line between external defense and internal control. Blowback isn't a theory. It's the mechanism by which empires bring their foreign methods home. And once those methods take root domestically, the republic that was meant to limit power becomes something else entirely. Every great power that begins to turn inward, using the tools of empire on itself, faces the same ultimate reckoning: the erosion of strategic clarity, the hollowing out of institutions, and the slow, almost invisible decay of the republic it claims to defend. The Trump administration's decision to transform the war on drugs into a projection of military power abroad and at home is not just another policy choice. It's a turning point. It marks the moment when a state built on constitutional limits began treating war as a permanent instrument of governance. That kind of drift carries a heavy price, and it is always paid in the same currency: credibility, capacity, and freedom. The United States already faces severe strategic overstretch. Our armed forces are tasked with defending a global empire of commitments that no longer matches our industrial base. Political unity or domestic will. Every unnecessary or politically motivated mission accelerates that strain. Turning counter-narcotics into an open-ended military campaign doesn't make the nation safer. It drains focus and resources from core strategic priorities. When we send ships and special operations forces to chase drug traffickers in the Caribbean under presidential fiat, we are not strengthening deterrence against peer competitors. We are weakening it. That's how empires decay, not through a single catastrophic defeat, but through endless peripheral wars that sap strength from the center. There's also the credibility cost. When military force is used for vague and legally questionable missions, allies stop trusting its purpose, and adversaries stop fearing its resolve. They see what we see inside the system, a force being stretched thin, politicized, and used as a personal instrument rather than a strategic tool. Credibility in geopolitics is not about slogans. It's about consistent, disciplined use of power. Once the armed forces are turned into props for domestic political theater, their deterrent value begins to erode. And once deterrence erodes, every adversary recalculates. At home, the cost is even higher. The Republic depends on clear boundaries between war and law, between the military and civilian authority, between foreign policy and domestic governance. When those boundaries are erased, you don't get strength, you get an unstable state. The executive accumulates power, Congress becomes a bystander, the courts grow hesitant, the public grows accustomed to the language of war as the language of politics, and soon the Republic starts to resemble the very empires it once defined itself against. The tragedy of America's drug war is not just that it failed to stop the flow of narcotics. It's that it created a permanent state of exception, a war that never ends, that justifies ever greater concentrations of power, that erodes the very foundations it claims to defend. Trump didn't invent this war, but he took its logic to its natural conclusion: unrestrained force, minimal oversight, and a presidency that acts without limit. That is not a sign of strength. It's the classic sign of a system in decline. Strategic realism demands the opposite. It demands clear objectives, limited commitments, and a refusal to confuse political theater with military necessity. If the United States is to remain a coherent power, it must dismantle the architecture of permanent war it has built around the drug crisis. Otherwise, the cost of this domestic war abroad will keep mounting until the republic that was supposed to lead collapses under the weight of its own contradictions. Empires rarely die in a single moment. They die in a series of choices like these.